Dad refused to walk me down the aisle, so my billionaire boss stepped in. When I was 5 years old, my dad told me that princesses didn't need to cry. One day, he said, I'll walk you down the aisle, and you'll be the most beautiful bride in the world. It's funny how childhood promises stick with us long after they should have faded away. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from. Then let's continue the story. I always thought my wedding day would be perfect. The dress, the flowers, the venue, all of it carefully selected over months of planning. But there was one detail I couldn't control: the empty space where my father should have been standing. Growing up as the daughter of a single dad wasn't always easy, but Dad and I had been inseparable once. Weekend fishing trips, science fair projects built in our garage, and movie nights with extra buttered popcorn. For years, it was just the two of us against the world. My mother had left when I was barely 3, a ghost in family photos that eventually disappeared altogether as my father removed them one by one. "It's just us now, princess," he'd say. "And that's all we need." Everything changed when I turned 13. Dad met Diane at a company Christmas party, and suddenly, our perfect duo became an awkward trio. Diane wasn't cruel. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, she was distant, perpetually uncomfortable around a teenage girl who reminded her that she wasn't the first woman in my father's life. The wedding invitation came just 6 months after they met. I stood in the back row during the ceremony, watching my father beam at his new bride in a way he hadn't looked at anyone in years. That night, I overheard Diane whispering to my father, "She's almost grown. Just a few more years and we can start our real life together." I tried to make it work. I really did. I learned to knock 3 times before entering rooms in my own home. I kept my music low and my opinions lower. I became invisible, a ghost in my own life, hoping that if I caused no ripples, I might still keep my place in my father's heart. By 16, I had mastered the art of self-sufficiency. I got my first job at Marino's Cafe, working after school and weekends. My father and Diane had started traveling more. Business trips that somehow always fell on my debate competitions or school concerts. "You understand, princess," my father would say, without quite meeting my eyes. "Diane's been stressed. We need this time together." I understood more than he realized. I understood that princess had become a word he used when guilt crept into his voice. I understood that the fishing gear collected dust in the garage now, replaced by golf clubs and weekend getaways. I understood that in his new world, there wasn't really room for me anymore. When I graduated high school with honors, Dad and Diane were there, sitting in the back row, arriving just as my name was being called. "Traffic," Dad explained later at the abbreviated celebration dinner where Diane checked her watch every 10 minutes. I accepted the explanation with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. The scholarship to State University came as a relief, a reason to pack my things and leave the house that no longer felt like home. College was where I finally started breathing again. My roommate Liz became the sister I never had, and weekends were filled with study groups and campus activities instead of tense, silent dinners. I called home every Sunday, a ritual that grew shorter as the semesters passed. Dad's questions became more perfunctory, and I learned to keep my answers brief and positive. "Everything's great, Dad. Classes are good. Yes, I'm eating enough." It was during my junior year that I landed the internship at Blackwell Industries. What started as a summer position extended into a part-time job through my senior year. That's where I met him, James Blackwell, CEO and founder. Not that I worked directly with him at first. I was just an intern in the marketing department, one of dozens in the gleaming downtown headquarters. I remember the first time he spoke to me. I had stayed late, working on a presentation that the marketing team needed the next morning. The office was nearly empty, just security guards and a few workaholics scattered across the building's 30 floors. I was so focused on my computer screen that I didn't hear him approach. "You've got the revenue projections wrong in slide 7. I nearly jumped out of my chair. James Blackwell stood there, suit jacket off, sleeves rolled up, looking at my screen with a frown. Not an angry frown, a puzzled one. I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwell," I stammered. "I'll fix it right away." "No need to apologize," he said, pulling up a chair beside me. "Show me what data you're working with." For the next hour, the billionaire CEO of Blackwell Industries sat next to me, walking through spreadsheets and marketing strategies. He didn't talk down to me or make me feel small. He asked questions, real questions, and listened to my answers as if they mattered. "You've got good instincts," he told me as we wrapped up. "Most people just copy the numbers they're given. You tried to understand them. That's rare." That night changed everything, though I didn't know it yet. Within weeks, I was moved to a special projects team that reported directly to the executive floor. My final year of college became a blur of classes, work, and increasingly challenging assignments. Somewhere along the way, James became a mentor, then a friend. What I didn't realize was that while I was building a new life, my old one was slipping further away. Dad's calls became monthly, then quarterly. When I tried reaching out, Diane would often answer, with excuses ready about why Dad couldn't come to the phone. The distance grew, mile by invisible mile, until the day I realized we were practically strangers. But that was okay. I had built my own life now. I had Liz, my colleagues, my career. And I had James, who saw something in me that even I hadn't recognized yet. I was no longer someone's forgotten daughter. I was Hannah, marketing specialist, future MBA candidate, and a woman who was finally finding her own path. Little did I know that path would lead me back to my father in a way I never expected. On the day that should have been the happiest of my life, my wedding day. The day I met Ryan felt like any other Tuesday. I was rushing through the Blackwell lobby, balancing a stack of presentation folders and a tray of coffees, when someone held the elevator door. "Going up?" he asked, with a smile that made me forget what floor I worked on. Ryan was the new head of legal at Blackwell Industries. Brilliant, kind, and completely unaware of how his blue eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. We started as elevator acquaintances, graduated to lunch colleagues, and 6 months later, found ourselves on our first real date at a tiny Italian restaurant where the owner knew him by name. "My dad would have liked you," Ryan told me that night, candlelight flickering between us. "He always said I should find someone who challenges me." I learned his father had passed away 3 years earlier. Cancer, swift and merciless. "What about your dad?" he asked. "What would he think of me?" I took a sip of wine before answering. "I'm not sure he thinks about me enough to have an opinion." Ryan didn't press, but I found myself telling him anyway. About the fishing trips that stopped, the empty chairs at graduation, the calls that never came. He listened without judgment, reaching across the table to take my hand when my voice wavered. "Some people don't know what they're throwing away," he said simply. Our relationship bloomed quickly, as if we'd both been waiting for each other without realizing it. Ryan became my confidant, my partner, my best friend. When James noticed, his eyes twinkled with approval. "About time the legal department did something useful," James joked during one of our weekly meetings. Later, more seriously, he added, "He's a good man, Hannah. I wouldn't have hired him otherwise." I hadn't realized how closely James had been watching over me until then. It wasn't just professional guidance he'd been offering all these years. It was something deeper, more paternal. He never overstepped or made it awkward, but the concern was there in 100 small ways. Making sure I took vacation days, asking about my MBA classes, remembering my birthday with a gift that always seemed impossibly perfect. When Ryan proposed a year later, down on one knee in the same elevator where we'd first met, I didn't hesitate. The ring was his grandmother's, a vintage sapphire that caught the light like a captured star. That night, giddy with happiness, I called my father. Diane answered, "Oh, Hannah!" What a surprise! Her voice held the practiced warmth of someone who's learned how to simulate interest. "Your father's at his golf thing. Can I take a message?" "I'm engaged," I said, the words tumbling out. "His name is Ryan. He's wonderful. I'd really like to tell Dad." "Engaged. Well, isn't that something?" A pause. "I'll have him call you back, sweetie." 3 days later, my phone finally rang. Dad sounded distant, as if calling from the bottom of a well. "Diane tells me congratulations are in order." "Yes," I said, suddenly feeling like I was 16 again, desperate for his approval. "Ryan's amazing, Dad. I can't wait for you to meet him." "Well, weddings are expensive these days," he said, skipping over the introduction entirely. "Diane and I are a bit stretched with the new vacation property, but we might be able to help with the flowers or something." I hadn't even asked for money. "Actually, Dad, I was hoping you'd walk me down the aisle." The silence stretched so long, I thought we'd been disconnected. "Let me check our calendar," he finally said. "When's the date?" I told him, and he promised to get back to me. That night, I cried in Ryan's arms, not sure why I'd expected anything different. The wedding planning consumed the next 6 months. We decided on a spring ceremony, something intimate but elegant, at a historic estate outside the city. Ryan's mother threw herself into helping, a whirlwind of warmth and practical advice who treated me like the daughter she never had. James insisted on giving us the honeymoon as a wedding gift. "My villa in Santorini," he said, waving away my protests. "It sits empty most of the year anyway. The staff will be delighted to have someone to fuss over." I still hadn't heard back from my father about walking me down the aisle. My calls went to voicemail. My texts received brief, non-committal responses. With 2 months to go, I drove to his house, determined to get an answer face to face. The neighborhood had changed. More manicured, more exclusive than I remembered. Dad and Diane had upgraded twice since I left for college, each house bigger and further from the modest home where I'd grown up. I parked in the circular driveway next to a gleaming new SUV. Diane answered the door in tennis whites, surprise flickering across her face. "Hannah, we weren't expecting you." "I was hoping to talk to Dad about the wedding." Her smile tightened. "He's playing a tournament today. I thought he told you." He hadn't, but I was already stepping past her into the foyer. "I'll wait." The house was a showcase, all gleaming surfaces and designer furniture, without a single photograph of me visible anywhere. I perched uncomfortably on an Art Deco sofa while Diane hovered, making small talk about the neighborhood association and her Pilates instructor. 3 hours later, I heard the garage door. Diane's posture changed instantly, a tension entering her shoulders. Dad appeared in golfing attire, his face flushing when he saw me. "Hannah, this is unexpected." I stood, suddenly aware of how much had changed between us. This man, tanned, distant, with carefully dyed hair and a country club membership, barely resembled the father who'd once taught me to bait a hook and ride a bike. "I need to know if you're walking me down the aisle, Dad. The wedding's in 8 weeks. He exchanged a look with Diane before answering. "About that. We've had a bit of a scheduling conflict come up." "A scheduling conflict?" I repeated. "The Andersons invited us to their yacht for a Mediterranean cruise. It was all very last minute. Bob only bought the boat in February. It's a networking opportunity I really can't pass up." The yacht. The networking opportunity. These things mattered more than his only daughter's wedding day. I stood there staring at this stranger who shared my DNA, and felt something inside me finally break free. "I see," I said quietly. "I hope you have a lovely trip." I was halfway to the door when he called after me. "We'll send a nice gift, of course. Maybe that crystal set you had on your registry." I didn't turn around. I didn't cry. I simply walked out the door, knowing I would never knock on it again. The drive back from my father's house was a blur. I don't remember the turns I took or the lights I stopped at. I just remember the hollow feeling in my chest. Not quite pain, not quite anger, but a strange emptiness where hope used to live. Ryan found me sitting in my parked car outside our apartment, staring at nothing. He didn't ask questions, just slid into the passenger seat and waited. When I finally told him what happened, his jaw tightened, but he didn't say the things I could see he wanted to say. Instead, he held my hand and asked, "What do you need?" "I need to stop pretending," I whispered. "I need to stop acting like I have a father who cares." That night, we revised our wedding plans. No father-daughter dance, no one to walk me down the aisle. I'd make the journey alone, I decided. After all, hadn't I been doing that for years already? The next morning at work, I buried myself in spreadsheets and conference calls, determined not to let the weekend's disappointment show. But James Blackwell had always been too perceptive. "You're unusually quiet today," he remarked, glancing up from the quarterly reports we were reviewing. We were in his corner office, Manhattan sprawling beneath us like a concrete galaxy. "Just wedding stress," I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Hannah." His voice was gentle but firm. "I've known you for 7 years. You don't crack under stress. You thrive on it. This is something else." Maybe it was his tone, or maybe I was just tired of pretending. The story spilled out. My father's rejection, the yacht trip, the crystal gift. With each detail, James's expression darkened. "So, I'll be walking down the aisle alone," I concluded. "It's fine. Really." James set down his pen with deliberate care. "No," he said simply. "You won't." "What do you mean?" He looked at me with an intensity I'd seen him use in board meetings right before announcing a company-saving decision. "Unless you object, I would be honored to walk you down the aisle." The offer caught me completely off guard. "James, you don't have to do that." "I'm aware," he said, a hint of a smile softening his features. "I want to, if you'll allow me." Something warm and unexpected bloomed in my chest. For 7 years, this man had guided me, believed in me, celebrated my victories, and helped me learn from my mistakes. He'd seen potential in me when I was just a college student working late on a presentation. While my own father had been drifting further away, James had been there, steady, supportive, kind. "I'd be honored," I said, surprised by the thickness in my voice. The relief on his face was palpable. "Good. That's settled then." He cleared his throat. "Now, about these projection models." We returned to work, but something had shifted. A weight I'd been carrying for longer than I realized had finally been set down. When I told Ryan that evening, his face lit up. "James is perfect," he said, pulling me into a hug. "Honestly, he's been more of a father to you than your dad ever was." The truth of those words hit me like a physical force. I'd never let myself see it so clearly before. How James had filled a role in my life that my father had abandoned. Not in an obvious way, not with grand gestures, but through consistent presence, through genuine interest, through the kind of quiet support that forms the foundation of what family should be. The weeks leading up to the wedding flew by in a flurry of final arrangements. I threw myself into preparations with renewed enthusiasm. Each time anxiety tried to creep in, Thoughts of my father on that yacht while I said my vows. I reminded myself of the people who would be there. Ryan, his mother, Liz, my maid of honor, and James, who had scheduled a board meeting around my wedding date without hesitation. 3 days before the ceremony, an envelope arrived at our apartment. Inside was a check with too many zeros and a card signed by my father and Diane. The message was brief and impersonal, as if written to a distant acquaintance. No mention of his absence, no well wishes for our marriage, just a generic, "Congratulations to you both," printed by the stationery company. Ryan found me staring at it, my hands trembling slightly. Without a word, he took the check, tore it in half, and then tore it again. "We don't need his money," he said firmly. "We never did." I nodded, feeling strangely lighter. "You're right." The eve of our wedding, James invited us to dinner. Just the 3 of us at his favorite restaurant, where the chef came out personally to wish us well. Over dessert, James cleared his throat and pulled out a small velvet box. "A small tradition in my family," he explained, sliding it across the table to me. "Something borrowed." Inside was a delicate pearl bracelet, simple yet elegant. "It was my mother's," James said. "She wore it at her wedding, and my sister wore it at hers. I'd be honored if you'd wear it at yours." "James, I started, emotion closing my throat. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "Just know that tomorrow, when I walk you down that aisle, I couldn't be prouder if you were my own daughter." Ryan squeezed my hand under the table as tears welled in my eyes. In that moment, I realized something profound. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who choose you, who see you clearly and love you anyway. Sometimes it's the connections you forge through trust and time, rather than the ones you're born into. That night, as Ryan and I parted ways until the ceremony, he was surprisingly traditional about not seeing the bride before the wedding, I felt a strange sense of completion. The space my father had left hadn't disappeared, but it had been filled by something stronger, something chosen rather than inherited. Tomorrow, I would walk down the aisle with a man who had earned the right to give me away. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't missing anything at all. My wedding day dawned clear and perfect, sunlight streaming through the windows of the bridal suite where Liz and Ryan's mother, Sandra, helped me prepare. In just a few hours, I would be walking down the aisle with James Blackwell, the billionaire CEO of Blackwell Industries. My boss, my mentor, and now the man who would give me away in place of my absent father. My dress hung by the window, catching the light. An ivory A-line with delicate lace detailing that Sandra had helped me find after 5 exhausting shopping trips. "You look radiant," Sandra said, fastening James's pearl bracelet around my wrist. "Absolutely beautiful." In the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The makeup artist had worked subtle magic, and my hair was swept up with a few tendrils framing my face. I looked grown up, complete, happy. The thought of my father briefly clouded my joy. Today was the day he'd promised to walk me down the aisle when I was just a little girl. I wondered if he even remembered that promise, or if he was too busy on the Andersons' yacht to think of me at all. "Stop," Liz commanded, catching my expression. I know that look. No sad thoughts today. She was right. I pushed thoughts of my father away and focused on the day ahead. On Ryan waiting for me, on our friends gathered to celebrate, on James who would be arriving soon to escort me. As if summoned by my thoughts, there was a gentle knock on the door. Sandra opened it, and James stood there in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking both distinguished and slightly nervous. "Is the bride ready for a visitor?" he asked. Liz and Sandra exchanged knowing glances. "We'll give you 2 a minute," Sandra said, ushering Liz out with her. James stepped into the room and stopped, his expression softening. "Hannah," he said quietly, "you look absolutely stunning." "Thank you," I managed, suddenly emotional. "And thank you for doing this today." He approached, taking my hands in his. "I've watched you grow from a determined intern into an extraordinary woman," said the man whose net worth was in the billions, whose name graced the Fortune 500 list year after year. Yet here he was, looking at me with genuine emotion. "Walking you down the aisle isn't a favor, it's one of the greatest honors of my life." I blinked back tears, careful not to ruin my makeup. I didn't think I'd be this emotional. "That's what these are for," James said, pulling out a pristine handkerchief. "My father gave me this advice. Always carry 2 handkerchiefs at weddings. One for yourself, one for someone else." He handed it to me with a smile. As I dabbed carefully at my eyes, James continued, "I have something for you. A gift." He reached into his pocket and produced a small blue box. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a small pendant, a compass. "So you always find your way," James explained, "though I've never known you to be lost for long." The thoughtfulness of the gift overwhelmed me. This man, a billionaire CEO who ran a global empire and could be anywhere in the world right now, had no obligation to me beyond a professional relationship, yet had shown more care and understanding than my own father ever had. "I don't know what to say," I whispered. "You don't need to say anything," James replied. "Just be happy, Hannah. That's all I've ever wanted for you." A soft knock announced the return of Liz and Sandra. "It's time," Liz said, her eyes widening at the necklace. "Oh, that's beautiful." James helped me fasten it around my neck, the compass nestling perfectly at my collarbone. Sandra handed me my bouquet, white roses and blue hydrangeas tied with a silk ribbon. And suddenly, everything was real. I was getting married. In moments, I would walk down the aisle to Ryan, surrounded by people who truly cared. We moved through the historic estate to the garden where the ceremony would take place. Through the stone archway, I could see our guests seated in white chairs on the lawn, spring flowers blooming around them in a riot of color. At the end of the aisle stood Ryan, handsome in his tuxedo, nervously adjusting his cuffs until his best man whispered something that made him laugh. The string quartet began playing, and my bridesmaids proceeded one by one. Then it was just James and me, waiting for our cue. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. I took a deep breath. "Ready." As the music changed to the bridal march, James and I stepped through the archway. Everyone rose, turning to watch our progress, but I barely noticed them. All I could see was Ryan, his face lighting up as our eyes met. Each step down the aisle felt significant, meaningful. I wasn't walking alone. James's arm was steady under my hand, his presence both protective and proud. This was how it should feel, I realized, to be given away by someone who values you, who sees your worth clearly. We reached the end of the aisle too quickly. The officiant smiled and asked, "Who gives this woman to be married?" James's voice rang clear and steady. "I do, with great honor and joy." He placed my hand in Ryan's, then stepped back to take his seat in the front row beside Sandra. The ceremony passed in a beautiful blur. We exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, promises of support and partnership that made several guests reach for tissues. When Ryan slipped the wedding band onto my finger, his hands were trembling slightly, and I loved him all the more for it. "By the power vested in me," the officiant finally said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Ryan's kiss was gentle and perfect, and the guests erupted in applause. As we turned to face them as a married couple, I caught James's eye. He was beaming, pride emanating from him like a physical force. The reception was magical. twinkling lights in the garden, delicious food, and a dance floor that stayed packed all night. For the father-daughter dance, James stepped in without hesitation, leading me confidently around the floor to "What a Wonderful World." "Thank you," I said as we danced, "for everything." "No thanks needed," he replied. "Though I do have one request." "Anything." "Don't be a stranger after the honeymoon. The office won't be the same without you stopping by." I laughed. "You'll still see me every day at work." "True, but this—" He gestured around at the celebration, at Ryan chatting with guests nearby, at the happiness surrounding us. "This makes us family now, in a way. And family is important to me." Family. The word had always been complicated for me, laden with disappointment and absence. But tonight, looking around at the people who had chosen to be here, who had supported us and celebrated with genuine joy, I understood its true meaning. As midnight approached and guests began to depart, Ryan and I stood arm in arm, watching our perfect day wind to a close. No part of me wished my father had been there. His absence was no longer a void. It was simply a fact, like the color of the sky or the changing of seasons. "Happy?" Ryan asked, pressing a kiss to my temple. "Completely," I answered truthfully. And I was. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Santorini was everything James had promised and more. The billionaire CEO's private villa clung to the cliffside, white walls gleaming against the impossible blue of the Aegean Sea. Ryan and I spent sun-drenched days exploring the island and star-filled nights on our private terrace, marveling at how perfectly everything had turned out. It was our third evening there when my phone buzzed with a notification. I almost ignored it. We'd promised each other minimal screen time during the honeymoon, but something made me glance down. It was an email from Diane. "Everything okay?" Ryan asked, noticing my expression change. I handed him the phone. The subject line read, "Your father wants to talk." Ryan's jaw tightened as he read the brief message. Apparently, my father had returned from his Mediterranean cruise to discover I'd gotten married without him. He was confused and hurt by my hasty decision to have someone else walk me down the aisle. "Hasty?" Ryan's voice dripped with disbelief. "You gave him months of notice." I took the phone back, staring at the screen until the words blurred. He actually thinks he's the victim here. "What are you going to do?" It was a good question. For years, I'd chased my father's approval, making myself smaller to fit into the corner of his life he'd relegated me to. I'd accepted his excuses, swallowed my disappointment, pretended his absences didn't matter. But something had changed. Standing on that Mediterranean terrace with the man I loved beside me and the memory of James's steady arm guiding me down the aisle, I realized I was finally free of that need. "Nothing," I said, deleting the email. "I'm going to do absolutely nothing." Ryan smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "Good." We returned to watching the sunset, and I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd set down a heavy burden I'd been carrying for too long. When we returned from our honeymoon, real life resumed with surprising ease. Ryan and I settled into our new apartment, a spacious condo closer to downtown that we'd purchased with the help of a generous wedding gift from James. I returned to Blackwell Industries, now as marketing director following a promotion James had announced at our rehearsal dinner. "You earned it," he'd told me when I tried to protest. "This has nothing to do with our personal relationship." The board approved it unanimously. My relationship with James shifted subtly after the wedding. Our professional dynamic remained intact. He was still demanding, still expected excellence, but there was a new dimension to our interactions, an unspoken understanding that we were more than just CEO and employee now. He began inviting Ryan and me to dinner monthly at his penthouse, where he'd regale us with stories from his early days building the company. He introduced us to his own circle of friends, Powerful men and women who treated us with unexpected warmth once they understood our connection to James. He never brings anyone around. An elderly woman who'd known James for decades confided to me at one such gathering. You must be quite special to him. I was beginning to understand just how unusual our relationship was. James Blackwell, the billionaire tycoon whose name regularly appeared in financial publications, who was known for his brilliant business acumen and formidable negotiation skills, had somehow become a surrogate father to me. Not in a showy public way. James was too private for that, but in the ways that mattered. 3 months after the wedding, the email came. Not from Diane this time, but from my father directly. I was in my office when it arrived, preparing for a presentation to the executive team. "We need to talk," the subject line read. The message itself was brief, asking me to meet him for lunch at his club the following day. No apology, no acknowledgement of his absence from my wedding, just an expectation that I would comply with his request. Once, I would have dropped everything to accommodate him. I would have rescheduled meetings, made excuses, rearranged my life for the chance at his approval. Now, I simply forwarded the email to Ryan with the message, "Look who suddenly remembered he has a daughter." My phone rang almost immediately. "What are you going to do?" Ryan asked. "I have a presentation tomorrow," I said simply. "I can't make lunch." "Are you going to respond?" I considered it. "Yes, he deserves that much." I crafted a polite but firm reply, explaining that my schedule was full, but suggesting he could call me the following week if he wished to talk. I kept my tone professional, detached, the way I might respond to a distant acquaintance. His response came within minutes, clearly composed in anger. The message was long, rambling, a mixture of guilt-tripping and indignation. How could I have let another man walk me down the aisle? How could I have excluded him from such an important day? Didn't I know how this made him look to his friends, to Diane's family? It was all about appearances, I realized. Not about missing a significant moment in his daughter's life, but about how my decision had affected his image. I showed the email to James during our weekly meeting, not seeking advice so much as sharing my bewilderment. He read it carefully, his expression darkening. "This," he said finally, tapping the screen, "is not about you. This is about a man who has realized too late what he threw away." What should I do? James considered for a moment. "What do you want to do?" It was such a simple question, but no one had ever really asked me that when it came to my father. What did I want? I want ... I began slowly. I want to stop pretending. I want to stop making excuses for him. I want to acknowledge that he chose, repeatedly, not to be in my life. James nodded. "Then that's what you should do." "But he's my father," I said, the words automatic after so many years. "Biology doesn't entitle anyone to your time or emotional energy, Hannah. Not if they haven't earned it." Now, coming from anyone else, the advice might have seemed harsh. But from James, a man who had demonstrated through actions rather than words what it meant to care for someone, it felt like permission. Permission to prioritize my own well-being, to protect the happiness I'd found. That night, I drafted one final email to my father. I didn't attack him or list his failures. I simply stated the truth, that I had found peace and happiness, that I was no longer waiting for him to be the father I needed, and that while I wished him well, I was moving forward with my life. "You made your choices," I concluded. "I've made mine." I sent the email before I could second-guess myself. Then I closed my laptop, went to the kitchen where Ryan was cooking dinner, and wrapped my arms around him from behind. "Everything okay?" he asked, turning to face me. "Yes," I said, and meant it. Everything is finally okay. 2 years have passed since that final email to my father. 2 years of building a life without the shadow of his approval hanging over me. It hasn't always been easy. Letting go of a lifetime of conditioning rarely is, but it has been liberating in ways I never expected. Ryan and I settled into married life with the kind of effortless compatibility that makes people around us roll their eyes and call us disgustingly perfect. We bought a house in the suburbs, a charming colonial with a yard big enough for the future we've been planning. I continued to climb the corporate ladder at Blackwell Industries, eventually becoming chief marketing officer when my predecessor retired. James remained a constant presence in our lives, less a boss now, though he certainly still was that in the office, and more the family we had chosen. He joined us for holidays, showed up unexpectedly with housewarming gifts, and never missed celebrating our milestones. The billionaire CEO who struck fear in boardrooms across the country would spend Sunday afternoons helping Ryan build our deck, his sleeves rolled up, designer watch carefully set aside. "You two are the closest thing to children I'll ever have," he confessed one Christmas Eve, after perhaps one whiskey too many. It was the most personal statement I'd ever heard from this intensely private man, and it moved me deeply. I never heard directly from my father again after that final email. Occasionally, news would filter through, mutual acquaintances, social media, the odd holiday card from Diane that arrived like clockwork each December. They had moved to Florida, bought into a retirement community, joined a new country club. Nothing that suggested any great revelation or change of heart. Until last month. I was in my office, preparing for an investor meeting, when my assistant knocked tentatively at my door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, looking uncomfortable. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he says he's your father." The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "Hannah?" My assistant looked concerned. "Should I tell him you're busy? I can have security escort him out." "No," I said finally. "It's okay. Send him in." The man who walked through my door was not the confident, self-assured country club member I remembered. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. His hair had gone completely gray, and he moved with a slight hesitation, as if uncertain of his welcome. "Hannah," he said, his voice rougher than I remembered. "Dad." The word felt strange on my tongue after so long. "What are you doing here?" He gestured awkwardly at the chair across from my desk. "May I?" I nodded, and he sat, his eyes taking in my office, the view of the city, the awards on the wall, the photo of Ryan and me on our first anniversary. "You've done well for yourself," he said finally. "Yes," I agreed. "I have." He fidgeted with his wedding ring, twisting it around his finger. "Diane and I are divorced," he said abruptly. 6 months ago." I hadn't known, but I wasn't surprised. "I'm sorry to hear that. Are you?" A flash of the old bitterness surfaced. "You never liked her." "It wasn't about liking her," I said carefully. "It was about how our relationship changed after she came into your life. But that was a long time ago." He nodded, looking down at his hands. "I've had a lot of time to think these past months. Living alone, it makes you reflect on your choices." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "I made a lot of bad ones when it came to you." I said nothing, waiting. "I told myself I was building a better life for us both," he continued. "That the promotions, the networking, the social climbing, it was all to give you opportunities. But somewhere along the way, I started believing my own excuses." He swallowed hard. "I chose Diane over you. I chose appearances over substance. I chose everything but what mattered. Part of me, a small, scarred part that would always be the little girl waiting by the window for her father to come home, wanted to rush around the desk and tell him it was okay, that I forgave him, that we could start over. But the woman I had become knew better. "Why are you here, Dad? After all this time?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a newspaper clipping. It was from the business section of the Times, a photo of me and James at last month's charity gala, along with an article about Blackwell Industries' latest philanthropic initiative. "I saw this," he said. "You looked so accomplished, so confident. And I realized I knew nothing about your life. Your real life, not the sanitized version in Christmas cards." He set the clipping on my desk. "I'm proud of you, Hannah. I just wanted you to know that." 5 years ago, those words would have meant everything. Now they were just words, spoken too late by a man who had forfeited his right to my emotional investment. "Thank you," I said simply. "I know I have no right to ask," he continued, his voice unsteady. "But I was hoping maybe we could have lunch sometime. Start small. Get to know each other again." Before I could answer, there was another knock at my door, and James walked in, focused on the tablet in his hands. "Hannah, the projections for the Singapore expansion?" He looked up, registering the visitor. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were in a meeting." "It's all right," I said, standing. "James, this is Roger Wells, my father." James's expression revealed nothing as he stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Wells?" My father stood, looking slightly dazed as he shook the hand of the Billionaire CEO. "Mr. Blackwell, it's an honor." "The honor would be mine," James said smoothly, "if I had done anything to deserve it. Your daughter, however, is quite another matter. She's the backbone of this company's marketing strategy. Brilliant, insightful, respected by everyone from the board to the newest intern." He glanced at me, his eyes warm. "You must be very proud." "I am," my father said quietly. James nodded, then turned to me. "The investor meeting starts in 20 minutes. I'll see you there?" "I'll be right behind you," I promised. As James left, closing the door behind him, I turned back to my father. "I need to prepare for this meeting." "Of course," he said, standing. "About lunch." I considered him for a long moment. The broken man before me was not the villain I had built in my mind over the years, nor was he the hero of my childhood memories. He was just a person who had made mistakes, who had lost his way, and was trying, however clumsily, to find his path back. "I can't promise anything," I said finally. "But you can call my assistant next week. We'll see about finding a time." Relief flooded his face. "Thank you, Hannah." As he left, I turned to the window, looking out at the city spread before me. I thought about James, who had stepped into a role he never asked for and fulfilled it with grace. I thought about Ryan, whose unwavering support had helped me rebuild my sense of self-worth. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, not to a perfect ending, but to a place of strength and self-determination. Some wounds never fully heal. Some absences can never be completely filled. But standing in my office that day, watching my father walk away with the possibility of a new beginning between us, I realized that I was no longer defined by what I had lost. I was defined by what I had found, by what I had built, by the family I had chosen. And that was more than enough. Some people will never change. The real question is, when will you stop waiting for them to? Have you ever had to create boundaries with family? Or has someone unexpected stepped up when you needed them most? Share your story in the comments below. If you found Hannah's journey meaningful, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories like hers. Don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember, sometimes the family we choose is more powerful than the family we're born into.